Before sunrise on Leyte Gulf, the sea looked too crowded to belong to nature. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, steel upon steel, wake behind wake. An entire ocean turned into machinery. This was not simply another fleet action. It was the moment the United States returned to the Philippines, and the Japanese Empire understood that if Leyte was lost, the southern lifeline of oil and raw materials might be severed for good. What followed would become one of the largest naval battles in history, a collision so vast that it seemed to erupt in every direction at once. On October 20th, 1944, American troops came ashore on Leyte. For General Douglas MacArthur, it was the fulfillment of a promise. For Tokyo, it was a strategic emergency. The Japanese response took shape under the name Shogo, Victory Operation, a desperate, complex plan meant to crush the invasion fleet in one violent stroke. If the beaches could be turned into a graveyard of burning transports, the land campaign might collapse before it truly began. That hope would send Japanese forces from north, south, and center into a trap built from distance, confusion, and overwhelming American air power. The Japanese plan was bold because it was born from weakness. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead a northern force of carriers that had little striking power left, but enough symbolic weight to tempt Admiral William Halsey northward. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would drive the center force through the Sibuyan Sea and San Bernardino Strait, then fall upon the American landing area from the east. From the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would push through Surigao Strait. It was a multi-pronged gamble designed to recreate the decisive fleet battle Japan had sought for years. Only now, it had to work under the shadow of near-certain losses. Kurita's center force was the heaviest striking formation Japan could still put to sea. It included the giant battleships Yamato and Musashi, ships built for the kind of surface duel the Navy still dreamed about, along with heavy cruisers and destroyers that had survived years of attrition. They sailed from Brunei through waters increasingly controlled by American submarines and aircraft. Even before the battle opened in full, the Japanese fleet was entering a battlefield where the enemy could see farther, strike first, and recover faster. That imbalance would reveal itself almost immediately. On October 23rd, in the narrow waters of Palawan Passage, American submarines struck first. USS Darter and USS Dace found Kurita's formation and fired into it at close range. The heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship, was mortally hit and sank. Maya went down as well, and Takao was crippled and forced back. Before the great carrier strikes, before the night actions in the straits, the Japanese plan had already been wounded. Kurita survived, transferred his flag, and continued on. But the road to Leyte had opened with sudden fire and cold water. On October 24th, the center force moved into the Sibuyan Sea. There, under a brightening tropical sky, one ship drew every eye. Musashi, sister to Yamato, one of the largest battleships ever built. She embodied the old theory of naval power. Armor thick enough to endure punishment, guns large enough to erase any opponent that came within range. But in the Pacific of 1944, size had become a kind of invitation. American aircraft did not need to duel Musashi. They only needed to find her, return in waves, and keep coming until mass and steel finally gave way. From American carriers, strike after strike was launched with mechanical precision. Hellcats climbed for cover, Helldivers rolled into position, Avengers lifted heavy with torpedoes. This was the invisible advantage that now decided naval war. Carriers could project force far beyond the horizon, then do it again a few hours later. Kurita's ships were powerful, but they were trapped in a tempo built by American flight decks. Every refueled plane, every rearmed squadron, meant another blow could fall before the Japanese had time to restore order, repair damage, or even understand where the next attack would come from. The attacks on Musashi were relentless. Bombs smashed her decks and superstructure. Torpedoes tore into her flanks, opening the hull to the sea. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the air with black bursts and tracer, but the American assault kept its rhythm, wave after wave, an industrial hammer descending from the sky. The old image of the battleship as master of the sea began to break apart in full public view. Here was a floating fortress under concentrated air attack, and the lesson was unmistakable. Even the mightiest surface ship could be reduced by patient, repeated blows from aircraft it could never reach. For a time, Kurita appeared to turn back. To American observers, it looked as though the center force might be retreating for good, but confusion was the native climate of Leyte Gulf. Radio reports were incomplete. Damage assessments clashed with instinct and doctrine. Kurita still believed he might yet reach the American transports if he pressed on. So while American commanders tried to read his movements from the air, the Japanese admiral weighed ruin against duty. Behind him, ships were damaged and men were dying. Ahead of him lay the chance, perhaps the last chance, to strike the invasion with battleship guns. By late afternoon, Musashi was finished. Listing heavily, shattered by repeated hits, she slowed, then fell out of formation. The sea that had once carried her like a symbol of imperial ambition now pulled her down by degrees. Fires burned across her decks. Sailors went into the water beneath a sky already darkening toward evening. The loss was more than tactical. It was psychological. One of Japan's greatest warships had been destroyed not in a grand artillery duel, but under air attack, methodically, almost inevitably. The future had arrived over the Sibuyan Sea, and it wore wings. And yet, the battle was far from over. After dark, Kurita reversed course again and drove eastward through San Bernardino Strait. Damaged, diminished, but still dangerous, the center force slipped through the northern gate toward the waters off Samar. That movement mattered because somewhere to the north, Admiral Halsey was making a decision of his own. He had seen Ozawa's carriers and believed the decisive opportunity lay there. In the hours ahead, Leyte Gulf would become a battle of separated commanders, missed assumptions, and lethal openings left in the dark. While Kurita pressed through the north, Vice Admiral Nishimura drove his southern force into Surigao Strait during the night of 24th to 25th October. It was a narrow, dangerous approach, and the Japanese went in almost like men entering a corridor already lined with guns. At the head was the battleship Yamashiro, with Fuso, the cruiser Mogami, and destroyers in company. Their orders demanded aggression, but geography offered almost none of the room a fleet preferred. In darkness, under uncertain signals, they were moving toward an American defense designed to crush exactly this kind of advance. The first American blows came from the edges. PT boats harried the Japanese line, reporting contact and sowing uncertainty. Then, destroyers moved in to launch torpedoes from the darkness. This was not spectacular in the way daylight carrier warfare was spectacular. It was more intimate, more brutal. Flashes in black water, sudden course changes, orders shouted into noise and smoke. Torpedoes struck. The Japanese formation began to bend and break. Even before the main American battle line opened fire, Surigao Strait was becoming a killing ground in layers. Waiting at the northern end was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. He had arranged his battleships, cruisers, and destroyers across the strait in a classic crossing of the T. It was an old naval idea executed with modern tools: radar, fire control, and disciplined positioning. Some of the American battleships present had been damaged at Pearl Harbor and raised again. Now, in the darkness of Surigao, they waited for a chance at something history was already beginning to phase out: a surface engagement in which battle lines would actually see their purpose fulfilled. When the moment came, it would be devastatingly one-sided. American guns opened with radar-guided precision. Shells crashed into the Japanese ships with a force that seemed almost abstract in the dark, each impact briefly revealing steel, fire, and spray
before the night swallowed it again. Fuso was lost in the chaos of torpedo hits and battle damage. Yamashiro fought on, but only for a time. The Southern force had run into a trap from which courage could not rescue it. Surigao Strait became one of the last battleship-against-battleship engagements in history, and it ended not in romance, but in destruction measured by radar ranges and overlapping fields of fire. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's following force arrived too late and in too much confusion to change the result. In the wreckage and smoke, ships collided, signals failed, and the Japanese withdrew southward. By dawn, Surigao Strait was littered with the evidence of a broken attack. One prong of Shogo had been annihilated. Yet Leyte Gulf would not resolve cleanly.
As Oldendorf's victory took shape in the south, an even more improbable struggle was beginning far to the northeast, where tiny American escort carriers and thin-skinned destroyers were about to face the surviving core of Kurita's fleet. During the night, Admiral Halsey took the bulk of his powerful Third Fleet north after Ozawa's decoy carriers. It was a decision shaped by doctrine, instinct, and the long American hunt for a decisive carrier action. To Halsey, the northern carriers looked like the main prize, but the consequence was stark. San Bernardino Strait was left uncovered. The battleships that might have blocked Kurita were no longer waiting there. At Leyte Gulf, decisions traveled slower than ships, and by the time warnings hardened into certainty, the gap in the American line had become dangerously real. At dawn on October 25th, the men of Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, were flying routine support missions off Samar when lookouts saw pagoda masts on the horizon. Then came the unmistakable flashes of heavy naval gunfire. Kurita's center force had emerged from the north. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, including Yamato herself, were bearing down on a formation of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts never intended to fight such an enemy alone. It was the worst imaginable mismatch, and it arrived with almost no warning. The American response was immediate and improvised. Escort carriers turned into the wind and launched whatever aircraft they could. Wildcats, Avengers, planes armed for ground support, planes barely armed at all. Pilots went forward with bombs, rockets, machine guns, or sometimes little more than nerve and the intention to harass. On the sea below, ships began laying smoke, trying to hide a fleet that could not outrun what was chasing it. Samar was becoming a battle fought not with elegant plans, but with seconds, courage, and every fragment of confusion the Americans could force upon their attackers. Then the destroyers turned and charged. USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Heermann went straight at a superior fleet whose shells could rip them apart in moments. Their size made the choice look almost absurd, but destroyers were built for aggression, and their captains understood that if they could force torpedo reactions, throw smoke, and break Japanese fire control, they might buy time for the carriers behind them. The charge at Samar remains one of the most astonishing acts of naval courage in the war, not because it changed the odds, but because it confronted them without illusion. Even the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, a ship built for convoy protection rather than fleet combat, threw herself into the fight. She closed at high speed, firing guns, launching torpedoes, and making so much noise and movement that larger Japanese ships were forced to react as though the threat before them was bigger than it should have been. That was the hidden power of Samar. Taffy 3 could not match Kurita in metal, but it could distort his picture of the battle. In rain squalls, smoke, and constant air attack, perception itself became a weapon. The price was terrible. Escort carrier USS Gambier Bay fell behind under heavy shell fire and was eventually sunk. Destroyers were hit again and again, their thin hulls no match for cruiser and battleship guns. Men fought fires, passed ammunition, manned open mounts under showers of fragments, and watched the horizon disappear inside smoke and spray. Yet the Japanese attack never became as simple as its weight of metal should have made it. American aircraft kept returning to strafe and bomb. Torpedo attacks disrupted formations. Reports contradicted one another. Kurita was winning the local fight, but losing clarity. Then, astonishingly, Kurita broke off the action. His ships had taken damage. Air attacks seemed endless. American resistance had been fiercer than expected. He feared larger carrier forces might be nearby. Whatever combination of caution, exhaustion, and battlefield confusion drove the choice, the effect was enormous. The Japanese center force turned away from the vulnerable transports in Leyte Gulf. Taffy 3 had not destroyed Kurita's fleet, but it had done something nearly as decisive. It had denied him the victory he came to claim. Against all probability, the small ships had held the line. Far to the north, Ozawa's decoy force had done exactly what it was meant to do. Its carriers no longer possessed the striking strength of earlier years, but they still carried immense symbolic gravity. For American commanders trained by the carrier battles of the Pacific, enemy flat tops were the natural center of the fight. So Halsey came north with force and confidence, not fully grasping that the real danger was already descending on Samar. Ozawa knew his carriers might not survive. Their purpose was not to win. It was to draw the American sword away from the point where Japan needed a shield. When American carrier aircraft found Ozawa, the result was predictable in material terms, even if strategically more complicated. Strike aircraft hammered the Japanese carriers through the morning. Among them was Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier that had taken part in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Her presence gave the action a grim symmetry. 3 years after Japan had opened the Pacific War with carrier aviation, one of the last great survivors of that first blow was now being finished under the weight of American naval air supremacy. The old offensive spirit still existed. The means to sustain it did not. Carrier after carrier was lost or crippled. Zuikaku sank. Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were also destroyed. Tactically, it was a major American success. Strategically, it carried a bitter undertone. Halsey had found and crushed the decoy, but while he did so, the battle off Samar had nearly become a catastrophe. Cape Engano, therefore, stands as one of Leyte Gulf's ironies, a clear victory that exposed a dangerous absence elsewhere. In war, even success can arrive attached to a question, and the question here was how close the invasion had come to disaster. By the time Halsey turned south, the crucial fight was already ending without him. Distance, fuel, timing, and the simple geometry of the Philippine seas all imposed their own verdict. That, too, is part of Leyte Gulf's story. Admirals did not command from an omniscient sky. They worked from reports, assumptions, doctrine, and human instinct. The battle's scale guaranteed misunderstanding. Forces fought on separated horizons. Messages lagged behind events. Decisions that made sense in 1 hour could look reckless in the next. Leyte Gulf was not only a contest of fleets, it was a contest of information, and no one saw the whole board clearly. The violence of Leyte Gulf did not end when the major fleet movements subsided. On October 25th, another terrible sign of Japan's desperation appeared in a more deliberate form. Special attack aircraft, what the world would soon call kamikazes, dove into American ships with pilot and machine fused into a single expendable weapon. This was not simply fanaticism in the abstract. It was strategy reduced to self-sacrifice, born from a navy and air arm that could no longer trade evenly in ships, planes, or trained aviators. If conventional strength had failed, then death itself would be used as striking power. USS St. Lo was struck and destroyed in one of the first devastating successes of that method. The explosion tore upward through the carrier with shocking suddenness, a violent punctuation mark after the day's already impossible sequence of battles. For American sailors, the kamikaze represented something new and deeply unsettling. A conventional air attack could be disrupted by fear, damage, or pilot judgment. A suicide attack carried its own grim logic all the way to impact. Leyte Gulf therefore opened not just the last great chapter of surface fleet warfare in the Pacific, but a darker chapter in the air war above it. When the battle was over, the Japanese Navy still possessed ships, but it no longer possessed strategic freedom. The losses at Leyte Gulf, carriers, battleships, cruisers, trained crews, and irreplaceable operational cohesion, shattered its ability to contest the Pacific on equal terms. Fuel shortages were already severe. Air groups were depleted. Surface units could still fight, but increasingly in fragments under conditions chosen by the enemy. Leyte Gulf did not physically erase the Imperial Japanese Navy in a single week. It did something more final. It broke the Navy as an effective instrument of decision. Across 4 connected actions, the Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, Samar, and Cape Engano, Leyte Gulf revealed the full transition of naval war. Battleships still fired and still killed, but aircraft set the pace. Surface courage still mattered, but radar, logistics, and operational reach mattered more. Small ships could alter history through audacity. Giant ships could vanish under repeated air attack. Carriers could win battles while also being used as bait. And beneath every dramatic image lay the same truth. Industrial war rewarded the side that could absorb losses, regenerate force, and keep the battle coherent across immense distances. That is why Leyte Gulf still endures in memory, not merely because it was huge, though it was, not merely because it was dramatic, though it overflowed with scenes almost too improbable to be believed. It endures because in those waters, the old and new forms of naval warfare collided all at once. Surface battle, carrier strike, submarine ambush, destroyer charge, radar-directed gunnery, and suicide attack all met in one vast storm of steel and human will. When the smoke cleared, the road back to the Philippines remained open, and Japan's naval empire had passed the point of recovery.